Hey folks, I'm Lucy at Ballyhoo Creations, and this is the video tutorial for the Yib puppet made with the sewing machine. He is a mouth, hand and rod is what he's called, the hand and rod puppet, because one hand works the mouth, and then the other hand works one or both of the arms. This puppet, the Yib, is a sewing machine pattern. I also have a different pattern called the Yab, which you actually use an embroidery machine or a single needle machine to make those puppets, and the stitching is automated for you. But if you don't have an embroidery machine and you have a sewing machine or you want to hand stitch, then the Yib puppet pattern will work for you. There is no foam in this construction method. So there is a special brain pillow inside of him, and there's, like I said, no foam construction. So this is a really easy pattern if you're wanting to start out as a beginner making a puppet. This is a good place to start. This tutorial will use fleece because it's very easy to show you what I'm doing, and I'm making this puppet right here in the tutorial. However, you can use fur, and I'll show you what some of those will look like. The basic pattern is going to look like this, and this is a fur, so it's hard to see what he looks like in there, but you've got the mouth, and this I actually did with the embroidery machine, but there is a pattern for the tongue that you could just glue in like that, and you could even do a stitch down the middle if you wanted to on your sewing machine. And you've got a small body with him, and then he's got the arms. Those are all part of the pattern. And this one, if you don't want to even mess with eyes, they look really good with sunglasses. That's a nice look. Then I've got this guy here. I call him Baxter, and he's actually made with a Sherpa fur, and then I've glued some long black fur onto his head. He's got some bat wing ears. There is a bonus pattern for different ears in the Yib puppet pattern. And then he's just got some fleece arms and, again, a Sherpa body. He's been romping in the swamps. He's got some moss on him, but he's also got some chest hair glued on. So you can do a lot of things with this pattern. Well, this is a pink Sherpa, and I've used just some safety eyes. There's a stem inside there. These are frog eyes you buy at the hobby shop. Very easy to make something like this. And back behind me here, I've got a few others that were made with the embroidery machine. And really the major difference is that they have the embroidered eyes and the tongue is embroidered in there. But everything else is pretty much the same. The instructions that come with your pattern include color photos and all the steps. All the details are in the instructions. But to be 100% sure that you knew exactly how this is made, I went ahead and made this video as well. So let's jump in and make a puppet. This step is optional. I like to transfer my patterns onto some clear plastic template material. I get these cutting mats from the Dollar Tree. They work great. You could also use a report cover, or you could go to the fabric store and buy template plastic, and it makes it much easier to trace around. So I like to do that, but you could use the paper patterns. Another option that I like to do sometimes, and this is especially helpful for the arms and hands, is I get this cutaway stabilizer. You buy that at the fabric store, and you transfer your pattern onto that. You just trace it onto this thin, easy to tear paper, and then you pin that to your fabric and you stitch directly on the stitch lines you put on the paper, and then you just tear this away when you're finished. So those are two options that you have, or you can just use your paper pattern to trace onto your fabric. And that's what we're going to do here, is trace the pattern pieces onto the fabric. I'm going to use a Sharpie marker so that it shows up really well for the video, but just in case that bleeds through your fabric, you really should use something that's fabric safe, like an air erasable pen or chalk or something like that. But for faux fur or fleece, usually the Sharpie does not bleed through. And for the brain piece that I'm doing here, you need to make sure you have a stretchy piece and a non-stretchy piece, and you put those together, trace that brain. Nothing complicated about that. I just like these plastic templates because it's so much easier to trace around. The paper kind of flips around and it's harder. And then pin your layers together so that you can go and stitch. And you're just going to sew directly on the lines that you marked on there. It's very easy. Once you learn this method of doing patterns like this, it's actually much easier, especially on detailed things like fingers. For that head and body piece, you need to make sure it's placed on the fold up at the top. And then you just go ahead and mark the back seam and the front seam. And then for the mouth, you got to remember that's a cut line, not a stitch line. And that's why on the pattern I have it a dotted line there. So I'm just going to mark the dotted line. So when I go to the sewing machine, I'm going to stitch on the solid line, and then I'll cut the dotted line. Marking the eyes in both places, that's optional. You could put the eyes wherever you want, and then pin the layers together so that it's easy to stitch. And then here's what all the pieces look like after I've traced them onto the fabric and pinned them together. They are ready to be sewn. And for the mouth plate, you can just use your pattern to trace that onto whatever material that you've decided to use. In the instructions, there's a list of things that you can choose for that. I'm using some recycled rubber here. And the tongue, same thing, just cut a little piece of fleece or felt for that. For stitching the puppet pieces together, I'm going to use my sewing machine, but if you prefer hand sewing, that is an option too. And on the seams, make sure that you backstitch at the start and end of each of the seams. That'll lock the stitches in place. And then you just sew right on those lines that you traced on the fabric. It's really that easy. And this method is very simple because you don't have to worry about lining up like the edge of the fabric or anything. You're just stitching directly on the lines that you drew. And remember, the mouth is for cutting, not for sewing, so we're going to skip that part and then do the back seam on the head and body. For stitching that little brain pillow, I would suggest that you have the stretchy fabric on top. That makes it a little bit easier. And if the stretchy fabric starts to kind of bunch up as you're stitching it, don't worry too much about that. If you have little wrinkles, that's fine because no one's going to see this. It's going to be up inside the puppet's head. So just get the general shape of this circular, oval shaped pillow and it'll work fine. The most important thing is to have a really stretchy, like a lycra fabric for one of the layers so that it will really bulge out and fill out the puppet's head. And leave an opening there for turning and stuffing. For the mouthpiece, you do not want to leave an opening, and if you're like me, you'll be stitching this and you'll go, oh my gosh, I forgot to leave the opening, I must have marked a pattern wrong or something. No, you do stitch all the way around the entire oval, and then we're going to cut it open later on, but all the sides have to be stitched up, so go ahead and do that. All the way around, there's no opening. Now the hands, this is the fun part here. Of course, backstitch, and I leave the little turning tabs on there because that reminds me to leave a little excess fabric to tuck in for the openings. And for the stitch length, I like to change it to a 2, and that makes it easier to do the fingers because the stitches are closer together and it makes the machine slow down a little bit. And I'm going to do this one in real time for a few of the fingers just so you see what's happening here. I'm just steering with my hands to go around the curves, and those little in between the fingers, you want to have 2 to 3 stitches there. That's very important so you can cut them apart later. And then just guide the fabric around the fingertips. If you want to, you could square those off and just pivot like we're doing in between the fingers there. You could do the fingertips squared off as well. Just make sure you get 2 to 3 stitches in between each finger. And just guide it around the curve, and you do all the fingers this way. If they're a little messy, don't worry about it too much. Once you turn it right side out, the fleece is very forgiving, and that probably won't show if you have some kind of wonky areas. If it's really bad, then just go stitch back over it again. Just be patient and do a lot of pivoting, stop and start, and just stay on your lines. And then do both of the arms the same way. all the pieces have been sewn together, and I've got everything here in one place. I've got the front seam on the body and head, back seam, and there's nothing here in the middle where the mouth is, but we've got it marked on the fabric where we're going to cut. Now, if you are using faux fur, you'll need to mark both sides and just cut the backing of the fur. But for fleece, we can cut both layers at once. And there is a little bit of a curve there. Just cut that out, and that's all there is to that piece. And then cut away the fabric from your seams with about a 1/4 inch of fabric left. So a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then just cut across the bottom. Again, if you're using fur, you only want to cut the backing of the fur. So you'll have to do one layer at a time. Fleece is easier. We can cut both sides at once. And then turn that right side out. And of course, you have to test it. See if it's working. It's working. For the mouth plate, this is the fabric mouth plate, and same thing, just cut 1/8 to a 1/4 inch away from your seam. You want a little bit of fabric left, but fleece doesn't really unravel, so you don't have to leave a lot. Now on the pattern piece, you should have marked where there's the center markings on both sides. That's on your pattern, so you could transfer the markings. And we're going to just pinch and separate the two layers, put a little snip, and cut one layer from side to side. And that's how we're going to turn it right side out. Just push out all of the edges, and that's going to fit into the head like that. It'll look a lot cleaner when we get to that part. For the brain, same thing. You just cut about maybe a 1/4 inch seam allowance here, because you've probably got some woven fabric there that's going to unravel. So you want to leave plenty around the edges there. Just cut out the brain. You can snip those corners. Don't cut your seams though. For the arms, since I used the tearaway stabilizer, I'm just going to tear it away from my seams. And because I used a very short stitch length, it's pretty easy to tear this stuff away. But again, you do have to have the right kind of materials. If you're using regular paper, it will not tear away easily. So the tearaway stabilizer comes off cleanly, and I'm just going to pull that away from the inside and outside. Speed through that. We're going to cut out the arms again using about 1/8 to a 1/4 inch seam allowance away from your seams. Make sure you don't cut your seams, and leave a little turning tab there. That'll help later on. When you're cutting out the fingers, you want to go all the way down to about 1/8 inch from the seams in between the fingers, and that way they'll separate nicely and you'll be able to pose them if you're going to wire the hands, or just you won't have a little pinch in between the fingers as long as you clip very close to your seams. And then trim away as much away from the fingertips as you can. Again, about 1/8 of an inch is fine for the fleece. And we do both arms that way. Now we've got all the pieces cut out, the head and body, the brain, the mouthpiece, and 2 arms. We're ready to turn them right side out. The head is very easy, just turn it right side out, nothing to it. Same with the mouthpiece, just flip both sides and push your seams out so it looks like an oval. The brain is very easy to turn because of that stretch fabric. And I'm going to use hemostats to turn the fingers. This makes it much easier. It's my preferred method. I just put the fingertip into the jaws of those hemostats and then pull it through. And fleece is very easy to turn right side out. This might take a little bit of practice, but it goes very quickly. This is real time. I'm not speeding up this video. That's how fast it goes. to turn those fingers with hemostats with a little bit of practice. So there's one arm and hand, and I like to use the blunt nose of the hemostats to just push out all of my seams and get those fingers completely turned. He's got cute fingers. And that tab is going to get tucked inside like that. We'll get to that in a little bit. And you do the same thing with the other arm, so I'll speed through that. Now that everything has been stitched and turned, we are ready to start assembling. Now we're ready to put the mouth plate together, and the rubber or whatever you've chosen for the hard mouth plate will go inside, and you just want to test fit. You could leave it like that if you wanted to. Your fingers are going to fit inside the way I'm showing here. But to get a better curve, I like to go ahead and cut the mouth plate in half, and your pattern has a line where you would want to cut that rigid mouthpiece. And then just put those two halves together and use a piece of duct tape or gaffer's tape or some kind of strong tape like this to tape those two together. And the reason that we're folding it and then taping it is that way you will have a little gap in the middle, and you're going to need that so that the mouth will fully close. And tape on both sides and then cut away the excess. That rigid mouth plate needs to be glued to the fabric mouth plate, and just glue one side at a time. It'll be easier. So put a little bit of glue on one side of it, and then you flip that over and glue it to the uncut side of the fabric mouth plate. And then you put some glue on the right side that you see that doesn't have glue on it. Again, glue it to the uncut side. And what you want is to be able to put your hands in like this. That should explain everything when you see how it's going to work. And then you just fit it into the puppet's head like this. I like to use some little clips and clip the top and bottom front, and then the little corners of his mouth as well. And you want the face fabric to overlap by at least 1/4 inch. I've got actually a little extra here. You don't want it to be on the sides of the mouth plate. You want it to overlap onto where like the gums would be. And then I'm going to show hot glue. You can either use fabric glue, you could use a hot glue that's made for fabric, or you could hand stitch with a ladder stitch. And I'll do a little bit of ladder stitch to show you how that looks too. But just hot glue that in there, and that's really my preferred method. It's very quick and easy. But if you are messy with hot glue or you have a bad glue gun, then you might not want to use that. I'm using a detailed tip glue gun here, and that makes a big difference. You get a nice thin bead of glue. And then you do that all the way around so you get the picture of how you would glue the head fabric onto the mouth plate this way. For the ladder stitch, your instructions has a diagram of what the ladder stitch looks like, but I'm just going to show you a few of the stitches here. You come up through the top and then grab a little, about 1/4 inch stitch length, and then tuck that in so that that stitch just disappears. Go back up to the face, which is the turquoise, and then straight down to the pink mouth plate. So it's going to look like railroad tracks, and when you pull it, the stitches just disappear. So you just alternate from one side to the other and make sure that you're going straight across each time. That'll give you a nice secure seam, and you should not be able to see your stitches if you're doing the proper ladder stitch. If you're using fleece or faux fur, it will disappear. If you're using a different fabric, you might be able to see some thread. So you always want to blend your thread in with the fabric that you're using. Obviously here I'm using a bright red thread so that you can see it against my other colors, but you would always want to choose threads that blend with your fabric. And that's what the ladder stitch looks like. You just do that all the way around the mouth plate. And I have another separate video about hand stitches for dolls and puppets if you need more information. If you're brand new to hand stitching and you really need to learn how that works, then I would recommend you watch that video as well. I call this a brain pillow because it's going to go up in the puppet's head. You can just stuff this pillow with scraps or with polyfill or whatever you have around. It doesn't really matter how pretty it is. And it's going to sit on top of your hand like that, up in the puppet's head. Just push it up in there, and I like to not close it, not glue it closed yet. Make sure I get the shape that I want. So if you need to pull it out and stuff it a little differently, you can do that. And then go ahead and glue the pillow closed and put it up in the puppet's head. And he's starting to take shape, but he's still pretty rough. He needs some work still. Alright, there's a lot of different ways that you can put your arms onto your puppet, and I have a separate video that shows a few different methods about puppet arms and arm rods. But for this one I'm just going to use some doll joints, and I place them on there to figure out the center circle, and then unlike when you're making a doll, the stem is actually going to go into the arm instead of into the body, and that way it won't poke you on the arm when you're working the puppet. So where they go on the body is right there at the bottom of the neck and on the sides. So I'm going to mark where the arms are going to go and snip a little hole there into the fleece and put the stems of the doll joints and poke them out. Sorry, I'm taking pictures for the instructions there. Boom. And then they just go ahead and make sure when you put the arms on, this is very important, make sure the thumbs are pointing upwards. That's why I did the little thumbs up there, because you don't want your thumbs pointing down. The arms would be backwards that way. So make sure you get them on the correct side, and be very careful when you're putting your joints, putting the holes in the joints, and that you put them on the correct side of the puppet. And then just use the joints the way that the instructions say. You push those little, little discs down onto the stem and lock it in place. So there's one arm attached. And then I just do regular stuffing on this one. Again, the arms and arm rod video have different ways that you could put wire in the hands. There's different ways you could do arm rods, but I'm keeping this one simple with just some polyfill up into the fingers and the arms. And you want to pat it pretty nicely around that shoulder area so that the stem isn't poking out. And this is going very fast. This is a 4x speed. So take your time on the stuffing. You want to have a little bit of a divot where the elbow is so that it moves, and same thing with the wrist. Just put a little part in the stuffing so that you get some movement there. And you can either ladder stitch or glue that opening shut. And you do the same thing for the other arm. For the tongue, that's very simple. You've already cut it out of felt or fleece. It doesn't fray, and then you just glue it in. If you wanted to stitch it before you completed the mouth plate, you could, but gluing these in works very well. For the nose, we're just stitching all the way around the circle. You can use big stitches with this, but you do need to use a strong thread. So you see the stitches go all the way around. And then take a little bit of filler and put it in the center, and then when you pull on that thread, it'll pull the edges around and you've got a little ball-shaped nose. And then use some stitches to just tack that together so that it won't come undone. I usually do 2 or 3. You don't want his nose to blow out. Pull everything tight, and then just tie a knot to secure those stitches. And I've got a long tail of thread left over. That way we can go ahead and stitch the nose onto the face. You could glue it, however, it's going to get floppy, and especially if kids are messing with it and playing with it and honking the nose, it's really better to hand stitch that nose onto the face. That's the best way of doing it. Just a stitch through the face and a stitch through the nose. That's the ladder stitch that we did before. And you can use bigger stitches for this. Just tuck that extra underneath there and hide it away. Then we can tie a knot. If you've got the brain pillow inside there, you may have stitched the nose onto the brain pillow, and that's fine, but it could cause a problem with putting the eyes in later, depending on what kind of eyes you're doing, so be aware of that. I'm just going to say it. There's no right or wrong way to embellish a puppet. You can do it however you want. I like to use some feathers for the hair, and this is just a hair clip. I pulled off the clip part and I glue the ostrich feather hair clip onto the puppet. If you wanted, you could just cut a little hole in the fleece and use the clip and everything. I'm playing with different kind of eyes here. I'm not really impressed with these little plastic like snake eyes. They look weird. So I've changed my mind and looking at a bunch of different options. You can use the plastic doll or plushy eyes, and you can even snip off the stem. I'm using some wire cutters to snip the stem off, and then you could glue them directly on to the puppet if you wanted to do that. Of course, you could use ping pong ball eyes, which are a classic Muppety puppet look. I'm just hot gluing these. I cut the stems off of these plastic eyes and I'm hot gluing them onto the puppet. And I'm going to add some eyelids on there too, so it's going to cover up that glue that you see. Or, you know, you could burn your finger like I just did. And for the eyelid, I just cut a piece of my scrap fleece. I cut it 3 times wider than the width of the eye, and that way you'll have a nice overlap. Just gluing it on with hot glue, or you could use a fabric glue if you prefer. You could also use the doll eyes and just poke a hole in the puppet's head and push the stems through and put the locking mechanisms on the back. The only reason I didn't do that on this puppet is because that brain pillow in there makes the eyes kind of a little crooked. So, and you also don't want to have those stems poking you in the hand. The brain pillow will protect your hand from those stems on the doll eyes, but it makes them not sit quite flat. So you can use them, just be aware of that. Sometimes it actually gives a better look because it makes the eyes bend in a particular way. All right, so we've got a working puppet. He needs something. He needs more. He's not quite done. He's going to need some arm rods, and the easiest way of doing an arm rod, you can buy an external arm rod. And again, I have a video on different ways to make arm rods, but you could also use a stick or a like a hanger straightened out, or I like to use the plastic balloon sticks from Dollar Tree and then use a little rubber band on the top of that, and that works for a very cheap and easy arm rod. This one I'm showing here is a purchased arm rod from Amazon. And then my separate video has a way of making your own internal arm rods as well. That's a little more advanced. All right, so he can emote. He can move at least one arm now, but he's still, I don't know, something's missing. He needs more. He's like naked. What else can we do? Okay, I've put a little t-shirt on him. This is a black t-shirt, and this is a size 6 months baby t-shirt. I don't like the shirts that overlap at the shoulders because they scream, hey, I'm a little baby, and I didn't want a baby puppet. So you can find, I get these at Hobby Lobby, they're size 6 months. You can find other t-shirts that look like a regular t-shirt, but they're really tiny baby sizes. And that's what I put on here, this black t-shirt. So now he looks more studly. And I've got some turquoise faux fur that is a matching color to his feathery hair. So I'm going to create a beard and mustache because I was pretty messy on his mouth for this video. I hot glued one side and I stitched another, and then I took it apart and hot glued. So he's messier than I usually do. So I'm going to cover that up with some facial hair, and you always have that option. Teeth are another good way to to cover up, and you could cut those out of fleece or felt or something like that. Just use your imagination. Some people use clay. I mean, there's all kinds of things you can do for facial hair and teeth and just all kinds of things if you're not real happy with how that mouth looks. A little bit more hot glue and just stick that under his nose, and now he's got a mustache and a little goatee beard and a black t-shirt, and now he looks like a really cool like beatnik dude with turquoise skin. He looks very different now just by doing those few little things.